It was June 4, 1942 at 10:22 in the morning, on the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Akagi, 325 sea miles northwest of Midway Island. Lieutenant Joy Tominaga held his flight list with hands that were still shaking from his bombing attack on Midway. Before we continue, show your support by subscribing and letting me know where you're watching from. Through the ship's bridge windows, he could see the controlled mess down below. Dive bombers were being moved to the side. Torpedo planes were having their torpedoes swapped for 1,760-pound bombs. Fuel lines snaked over the deck like metal snakes. In his pocket, a letter to his wife was still not finished, its final line saying, "The Americans are not here. Victory is for sure." He couldn't have known that at that very second American planes were already closing in on his location. He couldn't have known that the next 11 minutes would decide not only the destiny of 4 Japanese carriers, but the whole direction of the war in the Pacific. He couldn't have known that everything the Imperial Japanese Navy thought about carrier fighting, American abilities, and their own unbeatable reputation was about to be broken in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. Below him on the flight deck, Aircraft Mechanic Petty Officer First Class Koname Harada worked with frantic speed, overseeing the weapon change that Admiral Nagumo had called for just moments before. They had practiced for this, changing from bombs for land targets to weapons for ships, but never with so much pressure, never with scouts giving conflicting reports, never with the odd feeling that something was very wrong, even with all the proof of a Japanese advantage. At 10:20, the Japanese carriers had been the rulers of the Pacific. Their planes were getting ready to destroy what they thought was the only American carrier in the area. By 10:31, 3 of the 4 carriers would be sinking, turned into burning metal coffins by American dive bombers that seemed to appear from a clear sky. Those 11 minutes would show truths about modern sea warfare that neither Navy fully grasped until they happened in real time over the Pacific's vast blue expanse, the numbers showing Japanese naval strength seemed unbeatable on the morning of June 4, 1942. Admiral Tuichi Nagumo led the Kido Butai, the strongest carrier attack group ever put together. It had 4 main carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They had 248 planes flown by the most skilled naval pilots in the world. These were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean Raid, Darwin, and Ceylon. They were men who had sunk more Allied warships in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had in all its past wars combined. Against them, Admiral Chester Nimitz had placed 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown was quickly fixed from damage that should have taken 3 months to repair. It was made just good enough to sail in 72 hours by 1,400 men at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had 233 planes, most flown by pilots who had never been in a fight, many with less than 300 total hours in the air. The torpedo bomber groups were using the TBD Devastator, a plane so outdated that pilots nicknamed it the T-Bed. Captain Tairo Aoki of the Akagi had been sure of victory, writing in his war journal, "The American Navy is a broken power. After today, they will have no more carriers in the Pacific. The war will basically be finished." This confidence was not just empty boasting. The Japanese had won every carrier fight of the war. At the Battle of the Coral Sea just a month before, the first carrier versus carrier fight in history, they had sunk the USS Lexington, America's second biggest carrier, while only losing a light carrier. They had raided Darwin without any challenge, hit Ceylon with no resistance, and moved freely from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. What the Japanese were unaware of that morning could fill books. They didn't know that American code breakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had cracked their JN-25 naval code. They didn't know that Admiral Nimitz had seen their operation plans, knew their goal was Midway, knew what their force was made of, and had set up his carriers in an ambush at a spot called Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, an experienced Zero pilot on the carrier, would later say, "We acted as if the element of surprise was on our side. We thought the Americans believed we were heading for Hawaii or the Aleutians. We thought they had 1 working carrier at most in the Pacific. Every belief was incorrect, but we didn't realize we were wrong until the bombs began to fall." Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant planner who had designed the Pearl Harbor attack, was sick with pneumonia in his room on the Akagi. His being away from the command center would turn out to be very important. He was the only one among the Japanese leaders who had pushed for keeping a constant reserve of planes armed and ready for anti-ship missions. His replacement, Commander Tomoto Oishi, didn't have Genda's gut feeling or his worry about American carriers. The Japanese also had no idea that the Yorktown was working. Naval intelligence had confirmed she was badly damaged at the Coral Sea, which was correct. They figured it would take at least 3 months for repairs, which would have been right for any Japanese shipyard. They couldn't imagine that American workers at Pearl Harbor had done 3 months of work in 3 days, that welders had worked non-stop while the ship was moving, that her elevators had been fixed while she steamed toward Midway. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo had sent out 7 scout planes to look for American ships. This was already a risk. The rules called for dozens of scouts, but Nagumo wanted to save his planes for the attack on Midway. Each scout would fly a straight line out for 300 miles and back, leaving huge parts of the ocean unwatched. The most important search, line number 4, from the cruiser Tone, took off 30 minutes late because of catapult issues. This one mechanical problem would put the Tone's scout plane over the American fleet at the worst possible time for the Japanese, when their decks were crowded with planes being rearmed and refueled. Petty Officer First Class Amari, a scout plane spotter from the battleship Haruna, later said, "We flew our planned route and saw nothing but empty water. We were trained to see what we expected to see. Cargo ships, maybe a cruiser. No one was searching for American carriers because no one thought American carriers were out there." At 4:30 a.m., while it was still dark, 108 Japanese planes took off to attack Midway. There were 36 Zero fighters, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Kate torpedo bombers carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. Lieutenant Doichi Tomominaga was in charge of the attack. His plane had a radio that would soon send the message that would set off a series of deadly choices. The Midway attack group met strong resistance. American fighters, outdated Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, were waiting at a high altitude, alerted by radar. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy and on target. The Japanese lost 11 planes and had 14 others badly damaged. More importantly, Tomonaga radioed at 7 a.m. There is a need for a second attack wave. This message got to Admiral Nagumo, just as he was making the most critical choice of his career. He had kept 93 planes in reserve. Torpedo planes were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. American B-17s from Midway were bombing his fleet from high up. They weren't effective, but they forced his ships to make sharp turns. Torpedo bombers from Midway had just attacked, also without success, but it showed that Midway could still fight back. Commander Ryosaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu argued to keep the anti-ship weapons. "Sir, we should keep the reserve planes armed to attack ships. We have not heard from our scouts, but that doesn't mean there are no American ships." But Nagumo, feeling the pressure from the attacks and swayed by Tomonaga's message, made the critical choice at 7:15 a.m. Remove the torpedoes and load bombs for a land attack. What happened next was an organized mess that would lead to disaster. Each Type 97 Kate torpedo bomber held either one Type 91 torpedo or one 1,760-pound land attack bomb. To switch them, the plane had to be rolled to the hangar deck on an elevator. The torpedo had to be taken off with special carts. The bomb had to be put on with different hooks. The release system had to be changed for a different drop. The plane had to be brought back to the flight deck, and it had to be refueled for a new mission. Aviation Ordnance Man 2nd Class Tishi Maeda on the carrier later pictured the scene. "We worked like madmen. Torpedoes were piled on the hangar deck because putting them back in the storage room took too long. Fuel lines were everywhere. We were refueling planes while changing their weapons, something we were never supposed to do. But we had to save time. The hangar deck became a ticking time bomb, but we didn't think about it. We had practiced this hundreds of times. On the Akagi, things were even more complicated. The ship carried Type 99 dive bombers that could hold either 550-pound general-purpose bombs or 534-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs. The second type was for ships, the first for land targets. The crews not only had to switch bombs, but they had to switch the types of bombs, and each one needed different fuses and mounting gear. At 7:28 a.m., as the hectic weapon changing went on, the Tone's delayed scout plane finally got to its turning point. The pilot, Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Amari, was about to head back when he saw white wakes on the horizon. His radio message was unclear. See what looks like 10 enemy surface ships at bearing 0.10°, 240 miles from Midway, heading 150 degree, speed over 20 knots. Admiral Nagumo got this message at 7:40 a.m. 10 ships could be anything. Destroyers, troop carriers, cruisers, nothing that needed the immediate attention of his carrier force. He kept rearming for the land attack and told the scout to figure out what kind of ships they were and stay in contact. At 7:55 a.m., Nagumo got a message that would later come back to haunt him. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. A sense of relief washed over the command center. Cruisers and destroyers, no carriers. The rearming could go on. Some officers even cheered. Catching an American surface group without air cover would be great sport. But at 8:09 a.m., another message came. This one corrected the last report. Enemy forces with what appears to be 1 carrier bringing up the rear. The bridge of the Akagi broke out in contained alarm. A carrier, even just one, changed the whole situation. Within seconds, Nagumo gave new orders. Stop changing the weapons. Leave torpedoes on the planes that still have them. Get ready to launch an attack on the ship right away. But the situation down below had gone too far to turn back. Half the planes had bombs on them but not fused. Others had torpedoes partly attached. Some were on the flight deck with bombs while others were in the hangar with torpedoes. To launch a unified attack, all the planes had to be armed the same way. They needed at least 45 minutes to either finish putting on the bombs or switch back to torpedoes. The situation was actually worse than anyone realized. The returning Midway attack group was now getting close to the carriers, short on fuel, many damaged, all needing to land right away. The Navy's rules were strict. You get your planes back first, then you launch new attacks. To do it any other way would mean losing dozens of planes and, more importantly, their experienced pilots. At 8:30 a.m., Nagumo made his second deadly choice. Get the Midway attack group back first, then we will handle the American carrier. From 8:37 a.m. to 9:17 a.m., all 4 Japanese carriers were busy recovering the Midway attack group. This task, even in the best conditions, was complicated. Clear the flight deck of planes, turn the ship into the wind, bring back planes in order, damaged planes first, then fighters with the least fuel, then bombers. Move the landed planes below right away to make room, refuel and rearm them, and get new planes ready for takeoff. What the Japanese didn't realize was that time had already slipped away. At 7:02 a.m., Admiral Spruance on the Enterprise had made the most important choice of his career. Launch everything now at the farthest range without waiting to form a proper attack group. His air operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had argued, "Admiral, we'll be launching at a very long range. Many planes will not return." Spruance's answer was prophetic. "We may lose planes, but if we find them recovering their Midway attack, we'll find them at their weakest." The American carrier launch between 7:02 and 8:06 a.m. was a mess that was hardly under control and would have horrified Japanese flight teachers. Instead of a coordinated attack group with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers all showing up at once, each squadron took off as soon as it was ready and went on its own. From the Enterprise came 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in 2 groups, 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From the Hornet came 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From the Yorktown, which launched 2 hours later, came 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch was a failure by Japanese standards. Squadrons got separated, fighters flew at different heights from bombers. Radio rules fell apart. Navigation mistakes sent whole squadrons in the wrong directions. The Hornet's fighters and dive bombers never even found the Japanese fleet, running out of fuel and either crashing into the sea or going back to base. Ensign George Gay, a torpedo bomber pilot from the Hornet's VT-8 squadron, later described it. "We took off knowing we likely wouldn't return. Our squadron leader, Lieutenant Commander Waldron, told us plainly, 'We're going by ourselves. We will probably all be killed, but we are going to hit those carriers.' We flew separately from our fighters and dive bombers. It was a suicide mission, but it was our duty." At 9:18 a.m., just as the last Japanese plane from the Midway attack landed, radar on the Soryu picked up incoming planes low over the water. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's VT-8 squadron, 15 outdated torpedo bombers with no fighter protection, had located the Japanese fleet through amazing navigation and pure grit. It was a total slaughter. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down. 29 of the 30 crewmen were killed. Only Ensign Gay made it out, hiding under his seat cushion in the water, watching what happened next. Not one torpedo struck a Japanese ship, but the sacrifice, what seemed useless, had accomplished something vital. The Zeros had all gone down to sea level to attack the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers had been forced to make sharp turns, unable to get planes ready for takeoff. And most importantly, the attention of every Japanese lookout was aimed down at the water, not up at the sky. At 9:36 a.m., VT-6 from the Enterprise showed up. 14 more torpedo bombers, also without protection. They too were wiped out, losing 10 of their 14 planes without making a hit. At 10:08 a.m., Yorktown's VT-3 arrived. 12 more torpedo bombers with a few fighters. They lost 10 of their 12 planes and again scored no hits. At 10:20 a.m., the last of the American torpedo bombers was either destroyed or running away. The Japanese carriers started bringing back their Zeros, now low on ammo and fuel from the slaughter. Victory seemed total. Not a single torpedo had hit, and 35 of the 41 American torpedo bombers had been wiped out. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo finally let his guard down. His operations officer said, "Sir, we can be ready to launch our attack on the American carrier in 30 minutes. All planes are armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." The flight decks of all 4 carriers were full of aircraft. The Akagi had 40 planes on deck, fueled and armed. The Kaga had 30. The Soryu had 33. The Hiryu farther north had 38. Fuel lines were still hooked up to the planes. Weapon crews were making last-minute checks to bomb and torpedo mounts. Pilots were in their cockpits with their engines warming up. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had been flying in circles, looking for the Japanese fleet that wasn't where it should have been. Low on fuel, McCluskey had taken a guess. He followed a Japanese destroyer he saw speeding northeast. That guess took him right over the Japanese carriers at their most helpless moment. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's 33 dive bombers tipped over into their dives from 14,500 feet. The Zeros were down at sea level, getting more fuel. The anti-aircraft guns were aimed low for torpedo defense. The decks were covered with planes, fuel, and weapons. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, chose the Akagi as his target. In his report after the battle, he wrote, "The carrier was turning into the wind, its deck full of planes. I could see the crew running on the deck, fuel lines being dropped, planes trying to start their engines. They had maybe 60 seconds of warning, which was not nearly enough." At 10:26 a.m., Best's 1,000-pound bomb went through the Akagi's flight deck near the middle elevator. It blew up in the hangar deck among torpedoes and bombs that had been taken off planes and piled up against all safety rules. At the same time, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron dove on the Kaga. 4 bombs struck the huge carrier in less than 30 seconds. The first bomb hit the front, destroying the bridge and killing Captain Jisaku Okada and his whole staff right away. The next bombs hit among the tightly packed planes on deck. The chain reactions of explosions were disastrous. The 80,000 tons of fuel, torpedoes, and bombs on the Kaga started exploding one after another. Within minutes, the ship was a blazing fire from front to back. The heat was so strong that the firefighting teams couldn't get within 50 feet of the fire. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers arrived at almost the same time, aiming for the Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit the carrier in a perfect line down the flight deck. The first blew up in the front hangar. The second hit in the middle among the packed planes. The third destroyed the back elevator. The Soryu had a specific weakness. She carried extra plane fuel and tanks along the hangar deck sides to give her planes more range. These tanks burst open right away, creating a firestorm with temperatures that went over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. At 10:31 a.m., just as quickly as it started, the American attack was finished. McCluskey's dive bombers were flying home, many on their last drops of fuel. In only 11 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 main carriers had been turned from the most powerful warships in the world into flaming wrecks. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in shock on the bridge as explosions shook the ship under him. His operations officer, Commander Oishi, was yelling damage reports that seemed unreal. Flight deck gone, hangar deck on fire, all planes lost, steering gone, communications down. Captain Tairo Aoki grabbed Nagumo, who appeared to be frozen. "Admiral, we must move your flag. The ship is gone." On the Kaga, the situation was even worse. With the captain and top officers killed in the first bomb strike, command fell to the officer in charge of repairs, who was stuck below deck by the fire. The Soryu was sinking the fastest. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto would not leave his bridge even as the flames got closer. His last order, heard by a few survivors, was, "Save yourselves. I will stay with the Sori." He was last seen tying himself to the ship's wheel, set on going down with his ship. In the moments after 10:31 a.m., the Japanese Navy faced a problem far worse than anything they had planned for or seen before. 3/4 of their carrier attack power had been wiped out in less time than it took to do a single landing. On the Hiryu, the only carrier left, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched in shock as columns of smoke rose from his 3 sister ships. The numbers were terrible. In 11 minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 main carriers, about 110 planes on deck, over 40 planes in the hangars, and over 50 planes in the air with no place to land. They would in the end lose more than 2,000 skilled air and maintenance crew. The scene on the burning carriers was beyond words. On the Akagi, chain explosions went on for hours. Each blast sent sheets of steel flying like blades through rooms full of men. The hangar deck turned into an oven. On the Kaga, the ship's size, it was a converted battleship, meant more rooms and more trapped men. The fires above made it impossible to rescue them. The walls were so hot they glowed. Hundreds died trapped in steel rooms. The Soryu's chief engineer, Commander Kondo, survived to tell about the engine room disaster. The first bomb cut the steam pipes. Superheated steam at 750 degrees filled the rooms in an instant. Men were basically steamed to death. Others choked as the fires used up all the oxygen. Admiral Yamaguchi on the Hiryu faced a hopeless situation with his usual aggression. Even though he had only 1 carrier against 3 American ones, he right away ordered a counterattack. At 10:58 a.m., only 27 minutes after the American attack, the Hiryu sent out 18 Val dive bombers and 6 fighters. The attack found the Yorktown at 12 p.m. Even though they faced ready defenses and radar-guided fighter attacks, the experienced pilots pushed forward. 3 bombs hit the Yorktown, starting fires and damaging her boilers. The American carrier slowed down and stopped. Yamaguchi right away ordered a second attack. At 1:31 p.m., tinted Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros took off. This small group found the Yorktown again at 2:42 p.m. Despite heavy anti-aircraft fire that destroyed half of the attackers, they put 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown's left side. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning Midway attack, led this last assault. His plane had been damaged over Midway, and its left-wing fuel tank had a hole. He knew he didn't have enough fuel to get back, but he took off anyway. His torpedo was one of the 2 that hit. His plane crashed into the sea right after, having run out of fuel. At 5:03 p.m., the unavoidable happened. 24 American dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown found the Hiryu. 4 bombs turned the last Japanese carrier into another firestorm. Captain Tomio Kaku of the Hiryu, badly wounded, gave his last order. "Scuttle the ship. Save the crew." Admiral Yamaguchi decided to stay on board. His last message to his team was, "I will say sorry to the Emperor for the loss. You will rebuild the Navy." As the Japanese carriers burned, the officers who survived started to see how big their intelligence mistake had been. The proof was clear when they looked back. American carriers were in just the right spot. Midway was fully aware and ready. Submarines were placed along the Japanese travel routes. Attack planes were launched at the farthest range at the perfect time. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, the operations officer of the combined fleet, would later write, "We figured out that the Americans had been reading our mail. Every message, every order, every plan. We had been acting for a crowd that already knew the script. The surprise we thought we had really belonged to them. Beyond the intelligence mistake, the battle showed basic truths about carrier fighting that the Japanese had not grasped. Their whole strategy, massed carrier attacks, coordinated strikes, holding back reserves, had been right, but they had not been able to do it under pressure. The American dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless, had shown it was better than the famous Japanese Val in the only way that counted, staying alive while dropping its bombs. The American method of loading planes on the deck instead of in the hangar meant they could launch them faster. The American damage control methods, which the Japanese had made fun of as too careful, had already saved the Yorktown once and would save other carriers all through the war. As darkness came on June 4th, thousands of Japanese sailors were in the water or packed onto destroyers. The three carriers were still floating, but they were burning, abandoned wrecks on the horizon. Many Japanese sailors refused to be rescued, thinking they had let down the Emperor. Men would swim away from rescue ropes yelling, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years," and then dive under, holding their breath until they drowned. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans thought they were losing even as they were winning. Admiral Spruance, getting news of his missing squadrons, figured he had lost more than half his planes. The Yorktown was crippled and leaning. Japanese submarines were said to be everywhere. Spruance's choice to keep fighting despite the unknown would be vital. His scouts found the burning Japanese carriers that night, confirming how big the victory was. But even then, the Americans didn't totally understand what they had done. June 5th brought a cruel confirmation of American worries and Japanese disaster. The submarine I-168 sent by Yamamoto found the Yorktown being towed, moving very slowly. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit the Yorktown and 1 hit the destroyer Hammond next to it. The Yorktown would sink on June 7th, the last carrier lost at Midway. But by then, the result was set. The 4 Japanese carriers were gone, sunk by their own destroyers when it was obvious they couldn't be rescued. The human price of those 11 minutes kept growing for days. The Akagi was sunk at 5 a.m. on June 5th after burning for 19 hours. The Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4th, taking 801 men with her. The Soryu went down at 7:13 p.m. on June 4th with 701 souls. The Hiryu stayed afloat until 9:00 a.m. on June 5th, before vanishing under the waves with 392 men. The total number of Japanese deaths from the 4 carriers was 2,181. But these were not just sailors. They were the skilled mechanics who could fix complex plane engines, the weapon experts who could load torpedoes in minutes, the fuel workers who could refuel at sea, and the veteran pilots who had ruled half the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto on the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carrier group got the news in silence. His staff officer, Commander Yasuji Watanabe, described what happened. The admiral sat completely still for almost an hour after hearing about the 4th carrier's loss. Then he said softly, "The war is over. We will continue to fight, but the war is over." Yamamoto knew what others would take months to figure out. Japan had begun the war with 10 main and light carriers. In 6 months, they had lost 5. They could build new carriers, and they did, but they could not replace the trained crews. A carrier pilot needed 2 years of training. A good aircraft mechanic needed 18 months. A flight deck crew needed 6 months of hard practice to work well. The numbers were unavoidable. America had launched 17 new carriers by the time Japan was able to build one. American pilot training programs were creating 10,000 pilots a month by 1943. Japan never made more than 500 a month and couldn't replace its losses. The survivors of Midway had mental scars that hurt the entire Japanese Navy. The idea of being unbeatable was broken. The confidence that had powered their actions from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon disappeared in 11 minutes of dive bomber attacks. The Japanese Navy started new rules based on the lessons from Midway. Air patrols were always kept at high altitude. Decks were kept clear unless planes were about to launch. Weapons were put back in storage rooms right away. Multiple overlapping search patterns were used. Radio silence was given up for battle communication. But these fixes came too late and dealt with the effects, not the problem. The problem was that American intelligence, manufacturing, and new ideas had already passed Japan. For the Americans, those 11 minutes brought a different change, from desperate defenders to sure attackers. The Pacific Fleet, shaken by Pearl Harbor, had found out it could not just fight the Japanese Navy but beat it. Admiral Nimitz, on getting news of the victory, told his team, "They are not supermen. They can be defeated. They have been defeated. Now we go on the attack." The battle lessons were used right away. Dive bombers were the best ship killers. Coordinated attacks were best but not required. The advantage of striking first was key. Radar-guided fighter control was vital. Damage control could save ships that seemed lost. But the most important lesson was mental. Ensign George Gay, the only survivor of the Hornets VT-8, who had floated in the water watching the Japanese carriers burn, said it simply, "We had faced the best they had and destroyed it. After that, we knew we would win the war. It was just a question of time and blood. Later analysis showed the exact order of those 11 minutes in awful detail. American dive bombers had hit their targets about 52% of the time at Midway, much higher than in normal practice. They had done it at the perfect moment. The Japanese had shot down 35 of 41 torpedo bombers, an 85% kill rate. But those sacrificial attacks had set up the conditions for the dive bombers' success. The Japanese carriers had been caught in what naval experts call the vulnerable window. That is the moment when a carrier is most helpless. Planes being worked on prevent sharp turns. Fuel lines connected make fire certain. Weapons left out increase any damage, and attention being focused elsewhere stops early warnings. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the intelligence officer whose code breakers had made the ambush possible, noted, "We won because we knew when they would be weak, and we were fortunate enough to catch them at that exact time. 5 minutes sooner or later and the battle would have ended differently." Today, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers lie in Midway's deep waters, war graves for thousands. Oceanographer Robert Ballard's trips have found the Yorktown at 16,650 feet and the Kaga at 17,700 feet. Their wrecked bodies are proof of those 11 minutes. Recent trips in 2023 have given detailed looks at these wrecks, now protected inside the Papahānaumokuākea Marine National Monument. Survivors created memorials on both sides. At ceremonies, former foes met as friends, joined in recognizing a battle that changed the course of history. The Japanese Navy's effort to hide Midway's result from its own citizens, by keeping survivors apart, making them swear to keep it a secret and claiming victory while hiding the loss damaged morale across the fleet and started a habit of lying that would last until the wars. And historians have debated forever how different those 11 minutes could have been. If the Tone Scout had left on time, though strangely, modern studies show the delay actually helped the Japanese find the Americans sooner than they would have otherwise. If Nagumo had kept an attack group in reserve, if the American torpedo bombers had not attacked, if McCluskey had not followed that destroyer. But history has no other paths. What took place in those 11 minutes changed the world. Modern military planners still look at Midway for lessons that apply to today's fights. Having better information is still key. The advantage of striking first in high-tech war usually decides the winner. All military setups have times of great weakness. Personal choices made under stress still decide outcomes. Better systems beat better fighters. In letters, journals, and interviews gathered over many years, survivors gave personal pictures of those 11 minutes. American and Japanese stories agree on the chaos, the bravery, the fear, and the change that happened in those key moments. The U.S. Naval War College's study ends with, "Midway's 11 minutes are still the prime example of decisive military action. Never before or since has such a short period of time so totally turned around a strategic situation." Economic historians figure that those 11 minutes cost Japan about 2 billion yen in 1942 money, around 15% of Japan's yearly military spending. But the hidden costs were much higher. Pilot training programs were sped up, which lowered quality. Money and materials were taken from other projects to replace the carriers. The country's industry was pushed beyond what it could handle. Technical work was rushed, which led to problems in design. America, on the other hand, saw its war economy proven right. The carriers lost at Midway were replaced in a few months. The industrial power that had seemed impossible to Japanese watchers was only just getting started. In Japanese culture, Midway became a symbol for downfall, the moment when pride meets reality. The phrase Midway Syndrome came into Japanese business talk, meaning being too sure of oneself, leading to a huge failure. Japanese Admiral Tanaka Rizzo, writing after the war, said, "Those 11 minutes taught Japan that the time of the samurai was finished. Personal bravery, skill, and commitment meant nothing against organized intelligence, huge production, and better technology. We went into those 11 minutes as warriors. We came out as relics of the past." Survivors from both sides had their own unique mental loads. American dive bomber pilots who had brought death in those 11 minutes often felt guilty for surviving. Japanese sailors who made it through the firestorm felt shame for living when their ships were lost. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb destroyed the Akagi, never flew again because of a lung disease brought on by breathing a chemical from his plane's oxygen system. He spent decades thinking about the men he killed with that one perfectly aimed bomb. "I did my duty," he said in 1995. But duty doesn't make it easier to know that my success meant death for hundreds of men doing their duty. Modern computer models have recreated those 11 minutes in perfect detail, showing how thin the line was. If the American dive bombers had come 5 minutes later, the Japanese air patrol would have had more fuel and been at a high altitude. If they had come 10 minutes earlier, the Japanese decks would not have been full of planes. If the cloud cover had been 500 feet lower, the dive bombers could not have attacked. If the wind had been blowing in a different direction, the carriers could not have launched or brought back planes. The conclusion from the models is that those 11 minutes were the only time in a 2-hour span when the Japanese carriers were totally helpless. The Americans hit that window exactly. Military strategy all over the world changed because of those 11 minutes. Carriers started to work in spread-out groups instead of tight bunches. Air patrols kept multiple layers at different heights all the time. Deckload strikes became the normal way, reducing the risk in the hangar. Damage control became just as important as attack power. Gathering intelligence was given the same importance as operations. The U.S. Navy completely changed its carrier warfare guide based on what was learned at Midway. The Japanese Navy could not afford to make the changes their studies suggested. They didn't have the means to keep up a constant air patrol or to rearm quickly. In the end, those 11 minutes came down to personal human choices made under great stress. McCluskey's choice to follow the destroyer, Best's quick decision on which target to hit, Nagumo's deadly order to rearm, Spruance's calculated gamble to launch at the farthest range, individual pilots pushing their attacks even though they faced certain death. Admiral Spruance later said, "We won because our mistakes could be fixed and theirs could not." In those 11 minutes, every Japanese mistake was made bigger. Every American risk paid off. It was not justice or fate. It was chance finally catching up with risk. At the 75th anniversary of Midway in 2017, the last living people who were there spoke at the ceremony. Their words showed the importance of those 11 minutes that had shaped the rest of the 20th century. History remembers those 11 minutes as both a great victory and a necessary horror. They defined not just a battle but a whole period, showing that in modern war the advantage can change in a moment and forever. They proved that intelligence, technology, and industrial power are more important than tradition, training, and tactical skill. They showed that personal choices at key moments can matter more than years of planning. Between 10:20 and 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the path of human history changed. 3 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the tools of Pacific conquest, the signs of Japanese power, were turned into burning wrecks. The American planes, launched in desperate, messy attacks, had done what seemed impossible, a clear victory against a stronger force. Those 11 minutes showed that in modern war, the advantage can change in a moment and forever. They proved that intelligence, technology, and industrial power are more important than tradition, training, and tactical skill. They showed that personal choices at key moments can matter more than years of planning. The Japanese pilots who had controlled the Pacific skies for 6 months found out in 11 minutes that their power was a fantasy built on a short-term edge. The American pilots who had been seen as not as good found out they could destroy the world's best naval force when the situation was right. In those 11 minutes, 2,181 Japanese sailors and airmen would in the end die on the 4 carriers, joining 307 Americans in turning abstract war plans into human loss. Their sacrifice, both willing and unwilling, on the winning and losing sides created the turning point of the Pacific War. The carriers that sank took with them not just steel and fuel and ammo, but also dreams of empire, beliefs of being better, and faith in their destiny. They left behind widows who would never find out how their husbands died, children who would grow up without fathers, and countries forced to face the difference between stories and reality. Today, the Pacific Ocean flows quietly over the graves of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Yorktown rests close by, with American and Japanese wrecks sharing the same dark waters. They stay there as reminders of those 11 minutes when the future was made in falling bombs and rising fires, when young men died for things they believed in, and when the modern world was created in violence that felt like it would never end, but lasted less time than a coffee break. Those 11 minutes serve as history's most powerful lesson on the uselessness of military pride, the strength of intelligence and new ideas, and the awful price of strategic mistakes. They remind us that in war, as in life, everything can change in moments, that being stronger is always temporary, and that the cost of mistakes is paid with blood. The final word goes to Admiral Nagumo, who lived through those 11 minutes but never got over them. Before he died on Saipan in 1944, he wrote, "At Midway we learned that wars are not won by warriors but by systems. In 11 minutes, the American system destroyed our warrior tradition. We thought we were fighting the last war, only better. They were fighting the next war first. Those 11 minutes were not a battle. They were an execution of the outdated by the new." The American planes launched while Japanese pilots had those 11 minutes changed more than the Pacific War. They changed how humanity would fight, think about, and remember war. In those 11 minutes, the age of the warrior was over, and the age of the technologist started. The world has never been the same.